Hello and welcome back to the Okanagan Reader. I'm your host, Jim Bowering. Here's your location reveal for the last remote video. We were at Area 27, the racetrack. Here, have a look at today's location, see if you can identify it. As usual, traffic, but of course, you can hardly hear it, right? So, today's reading is unless, of course, it's a noisy motorcycle. Today's reading is Chapter 39 of Green Comet, the first book in the Green Comet trilogy. In Chapter 39, Elgin watches over the Wakers while Stanton pores over the data from the destruction of the little comet. The Scout's fixation on destroying it seems almost insane. They're sure no one could have survived. After waiting for instructions from the inner system, the Scout starts probing Green Comet with radar. Fran is hurt. Well, I hope this worked out okay. Here we go then.
Chapter 39. They Lose Buzzard. The Wakers were sitting around the table in the other room. They weren't doing much yet. There was no talking. They weren't even looking at each other, or anything else in the room either. Their eyes were open, and the visual signals were getting to their brains, but it didn't have much to do with what they were seeing in there. The dislocation and disorientation weren't nearly as bad as they were after full hibernation, but they were still there. Elgin was sitting with them, waiting for them to become lucid. It only took 3 or 4 hours rather than 3 or 4 days, but it was still inevitable and couldn't be hurried. Stanton was in the ops room monitoring the activities of the Scout and poring over the data, looking for anything that might give them hope that their friends had survived. He wasn't finding it. Instead, he was witness to the Scout's systematic destruction of the little comet. It was blasting big chunks of it into smaller chunks, then blasting those into smaller chunks again. Watching it, Stanton thought it looked obsessive, or even insane. Long after it was obvious that nothing living could have survived, it continued pulverizing the remains of the little comet. He smiled a small, painful smile. "I don't know what you did, Buzzard," he whispered proudly, "but you really seem to have pissed it off." Back at the table the Wakers were sitting, each with a cup of iceberry tea between their hands. Nigel's mouth was open, making him look a bit stunned, and that pleased Elgin. Argue against Francis, would he? Making it personal, too. Well, just wait until you wake up. Then you'll see how wrong you were. But then Elgin remembered what it had cost to prove that Fran was right. His mean joy died, and he reached out and gently lifted Nigel's chin. Nigel swallowed and focused on Elgin, who could see awareness in his eyes for a second or two before it went away again. That was an indicator that he would be coming out of it soon, and indeed, over the next few minutes his eyes oscillated between a vacant stare and intelligent focus. At last, during the occupied moments, his throat and jaw began working as he tried to speak. Elgin reached across the table and patted his hands wrapped around the cup. Nigel, after a pause, looked down and, after another pause, slowly lifted the cup to his face. He took a small sniff, and his expression intensified. A large drink stayed in his mouth until his throat remembered what to do with it. Then Elgin saw the jolt as his body welcomed the warm liquid. As he thirstily attacked the rest of the tea, Elgin glanced to his right where Fran was beginning to stir. The first thing he saw was her shining golden eyes locked on his, the light of awareness in them, along with what he could only interpret as knowing. All that in a second and, as she cycled away, potent sadness. Across the table, Nigel was awake for sure. His concentration still wandered, but it remained in this world, and he had pulled himself together enough to croak, "What?" Elgin looked at him and said slowly and clearly, "It's happening." He waited until that registered, then he pointed to his left. "Watch the doctor." When he was sure that was understood, he turned back to Fran. He looked directly into her eyes, so each time she surfaced she would see him right there. He reached out so his hand was touching hers, and watched her rejoin the world. In his mind's eye, Stanton could see the bodies floating amongst the debris. His mind's eye shied away from anything that looked like Buzzard's body. All the while the Scout was motionless in an expanding field of rubble. Since it fired its last shot it hadn't done anything, as far as Stanton could see. He wondered what it could be doing. Was it scanning the remains of the comet, looking for signs of life? Surely that couldn't take long. He couldn't say why, but he got the impression that it was waiting. What would it be waiting for? Reinforcements? No, definitely not. He shook his head and scowled at the image on the monitor. "What are you up to?" he growled. At the table, Frances was working up to talking. She had had some tea, with a sensuous shiver of appreciation, and now she was forming the question that Elgin anticipated and dreaded. Finally, her eyes on his, she whispered, "Buzzard?" Elgin looked down, and when he looked back up he could tell that she knew. He took her hands in his and told her, "The little comet has been destroyed. No one could have survived." She lowered her head and cried softly for their friend. When she looked up again she asked, "Stanton?" He nodded, then shook his head. "He's taking it pretty hard." Her face showed how deeply her enhanced sympathy was cutting her. His face showed how much her pain was hurting him. She asked, "The Scout?" "It's not doing anything." She took only a moment before she said, "Calling home." Another moment then, "How far out?" "About 12 light hours," said Elgin. "Tomorrow then," she said, and closed her eyes. The next day everyone was fully awake and completely caught up. Fran isolated the salient points. "It reacted the same way every time?" she asked when she heard about the radar. "And about the lasers, are you sure there were only 15? You couldn't have missed any?" "No," said Stanton. "All the lasers and all the radars were on this side of the little comet, or at least visible from here." "Buzzard must have planned it that way," mused Fran. "Then later you said you thought it looked like it might be a little insane?" "Yes," said Stanton. "Kind of obsessive." He thought about it. It was as if it was doing it because it had to, rather than as a rational strategy. He added, "And Buzzard definitely planned it. There's no doubt in my mind about that." "Yes," agreed Fran. "I think we should be looking at this with the assumption that Buzzard planned everything." She smiled. "We should be looking for details in the details." Stanton laughed. Then his face collapsed in grief. Fran went directly to him and wrapped him in a hug, holding him tightly while he sobbed. After only a moment he broke away, collecting himself and giving her a nod of thanks. He looked at Elgin, who nodded back at him. The moment was broken by a quiet beeping from the console. "Radio," said Nigel, who was on watch. "Radio?" said the doctor, who normally listened much more than he spoke. "They're trying to talk to us?" "No," said Nigel. "It's much too attenuated. I think it's coming from the inner system." "That will be instructions," said Fran. "It's about 24 hours since the Scout did anything, right?" "Right," said Elgin. "And we're about 12 hours out. I guess after it was finished with the little comet, it must have needed to call in before it could do anything else." "Don't lose that recording, Nigel," said Fran. "We're going to want to study it." "Right," he said. "This will more than double our sample of its language already. I will back up the backups." "Good," said Fran. "Now, here's hoping the message is telling the Scout to pack up and go home." Everyone chimed in on that. There were a few imaginative, humorous guesses at what was said as they tried to loosen the tension. Fran saw, though, that Stanton was only half-heartedly involved. The way he was glowering at the monitor, she got the impression that he'd just as soon the scout stayed. She knew he had unfinished business there. After 10 minutes, the incoming message stopped. It wouldn't be as much information to study as they might have thought, since the data rate was relatively low. But it was enough for the scout. Almost as soon as it ended, alarms started up, along with flashing lights. "Radar," said Nigel, 40 gigahertz and strong. The doctor said, "The alarms indicate dangerous levels of ionizing radiation. Thank goodness we have the shielding." "And the inverse square law," said Elgin. Nigel turned off the audible alarms, but left the lights flashing. For synesthetes, the lights were still pretty noisy, but they were going to have to put up with it because they needed the information. The lights were arrayed in a way that showed them which part of the comet was being struck by the radar beam, so they could observe the scout's search pattern. When it passed their location, the doctor shook his head and tut-tutted, no doubt imagining what the radiation was doing to their insides. They were able to tell that the scout didn't move during the probe by the fact that the radar source didn't move. In addition, they had a kind of radar image of it. The part of the beam that reflected off the comet was naturally scattered, but some of it went back to the scout. Part of that hit its receivers, but the rest was again scattered, some of it in the direction of Green Comet. The part of that which struck their receivers was a very tiny portion of the original beam, at times only single photons, but over time it built up a crude picture. Even the most bizarre situations, if nothing changes for a long time, become repetitive. Oddly, even in dire circumstances, the mind can begin to wander. Seeing this, Fran said, "I'm going to get some iceberry juice. Does anyone want any?" They all did, so she went into the other room to get it. She was barely gone when they heard her shriek. Elgin tore in there and found her curled up, her mouth open in a silent scream of pain.